Hey folks, George here again to talk about another work of Japanese literature. This time we're going to be exploring the famous essay In Praise of Shadows by Tanizaki Jun'ichiro. This essay is really his discussion or his lament or his engagement with this modern age that he sees himself in, that he finds himself in, versus the traditional past and how he's got to engage and balance, and what is the relationship between modernization and this traditional past. Well, he focuses on a few key ideas from his perspective and given his values. And yeah, don't be mistaken, this essay is a very value-laden essay, and we really see the values that Tanizaki is trying to present to us, his own personal values, and how he wrestles with those values in a changing modernization that values certain things quite differently than the past did. I think this makes this essay something that we can all speak to. After all, how many of us have said to ourselves even, "Oh my goodness, things were so much better in my day, in the past. Oh, kids these days." And I feel like Tanizaki is expressing that sort of sentiment throughout. Well, we get to engage with that sort of sentiment, and it helps us reflect upon our own similar sentiments regarding our engagement with the past versus our engagement with the present. Yeah, and I find that to be a fascinating aspect of this particular essay. So, as always, we will be discussing the four story elements. We'll be talking about the characters. Who are they? Why are they interesting? The setting. What is it? Why is it interesting? The plot, or thesis in this case, since it's an essay. And of course, the themes that he explores. The themes are going to be very rich in this essay. Of course, we're going to talk a little bit about the text also, and also intertextual connections, as well as history. We'll talk a lot about history in this when we engage with this essay. And finally, we'll wrap it up with some of my own contemplations, some of my own reflections. How this essay speaks to me personally, things like that, yeah? So let's talk about the characters. This will be really fast and easy. Of course, Tanizaki is writing about himself and his own values. And so you can consider this a very personal essay regarding his values, what he values, how he values them, reasons also. That's what I really like about this, not merely what he values, but the reasons why he values these. And he tries to justify his values in very interesting ways. But that's just about it. We don't really engage with other people. He doesn't even really engage with the modern Japanese person whom he seems to, like I said, treat like a little kid that's jumping all over his lawn. He doesn't really engage with that too much. Or does he? Well, we'll see a little bit, but we never really meet anybody else except for Tanizaki in this essay. Well, let's talk about the setting then. Let's move on to setting. And for the setting, I think it's going to be just as interesting to talk about the history of Japan in 1933. This essay was published, of course, in 1933. What was Japan like in 1933? Well, we were already entering the Showa era, the early Showa era, but there's this interesting period, this interwar period, basically, between the First World War and the Second World War. And of course, Japan played a much more significant role in World War II, which is a few years after this essay was written. Except, was it? The traditional dates for the beginning of World War II in the Pacific, that is Japan's part of the war, are typically the Marco Polo Bridge incident in 1937. 1937 is typically given as the start of World War II in the Pacific, World War II in Japan, as Japan is waging war against Chiang Kai-shek and the Chinese Republic. However, is 1937 the best year to pick for the beginning of World War II from the Japanese perspective? I'm not so sure. And some scholars do debate. Of course, classic textbooks will 1937 will list 1937 as a very nice and cut and dry starting date for World War II. However, Japan was already in China prior to this. As a matter of fact, the first Japanese-Chinese War was in much earlier in the century, right? And furthermore, Japan had already annexed and implemented a puppet government in China much earlier than that. Some people would push the start date for World War II all the way back to 1931. And what happened in 1931? The Manchurian incident, what we call in English, what I call in English, the Manchurian incident, where there was a sort of sabotage of something that instigated Japan invading Manchuria, taking over a huge swath of China, and implementing and putting in place their own Manchukuo emperor, right, who was ultimately a puppet of Japan. So with that kind of background, what is Japan like then? Well, we see the rise, of course, since since the Meiji era, this gradual rise towards ultranationalism in Japan, which would, of course, culminate in World War II, and which, of course, was overthrown when World War II was ended in 1945. However, this is what Japan smells like in this pre-war, what many people are going to call it pre-war Japan. Japan smells, there's the scent of ultranationalism everywhere. Now, what do I mean by ultranationalism? Well, obviously, the most obvious way to talk about ultranationalism is that Japan is invading other countries. What does that entail? That entails that there is a sort of pride that exists in Japan, such that Japanese-ness is what shall spread throughout Asia. Now, is it more complicated than that? Of course it is, because if we would have asked a Japanese general during this era, they certainly wouldn't talk about Japanese pride. As a matter of fact, they would talk about something closer to Asian pride. And furthermore, Asia for Asians. Why would you have to say Asia is for the Asians? Well, because all the European powers were conquering and colonizing different parts of Asia as well. And from one perspective, Japan might suggest, well, we're just trying to do what we can do to save Asia for Asians. Of course, from a European perspective, what some people would criticize Japan for doing is merely becoming a further imperialist power and trying to invade China, get their chunk of China before the British and the Germans do, right? And so that's what complicates things quite a bit around here. Obviously, by this time, for Japan to be such a successful military power in this pre-war era and in the early 20th century, there's a lot of modernization that's going on. And that's not just technological modernization, but of course political modernization, artistic modernization, right? And so on and so forth, scientific modernization as well. And so it's in this historical context that we have to understand Tanizaki's essay here. Now, to be sure, Tanizaki doesn't mention anything about militarism, and he doesn't really talk about anything regarding politics either. However, he does talk about aesthetics and art. Aesthetics being a philosophy of art, or the value of art, or the theory of valuable or good art. And he really gives his own aesthetic theory here regarding how art ought to be made, or rather lamenting that art isn't made in the way that he prefers, or in a certain way, at least, anymore. So let's see how he engages with his theory of aesthetics, because that really is his thesis now. Let's talk about the plot of this essay, or the thesis that he's trying to put forth, and that is that he really is lamenting that modern Japan is foregoing the artistic values of traditional Japan. And that's the challenge that he sees of modernization. He's not going to talk about military, he's not going to talk about politics, but he is talking about how the modern Japanese are forgetting or foregoing traditional values, traditional artistic values from the past, and substituting them or replacing them with these modern and Western aesthetic values. How do we engage with that when we see, I think this is Tanizaki's problem and the thesis that he's putting forward, how do we deal with modernization when we see our own culture disappearing? That's really what he's lamenting, the disappearance of his culture or the culture of the past. And we'll see here the edition of In Praise of Shadows that I'm reading from here. It's the Thomas Harper and Edward Seidensticker translation by Leyte Island Books, published in 1977. So we'll see here right on page 1, right at the beginning, how he really engages and tries to put forward his own thesis. A bit in the middle of that first paragraph, he says, "For the solitary eccentric, it's another matter. He can ignore the blessings of scientific civilization and retreat to some forsaken corner of the countryside. But a man who has a family and lives in the city cannot turn his back on the necessities of modern life. Heating, electric lights, sanitary facilities, merely for the sake of doing things the Japanese way." So what is interesting about that excerpt right there? He's bringing up two different, it seems to me at least as a first-time reader, it seems to me that he's putting at odds two different ideas. One being the scientific civilization. He says a solitary hermit can abandon scientific civilization. And I think that's his way of talking about modern civilization being scientific civilization. And he talks about some of the blessings of scientific civilization, especially for people with families. What does he say? Heating, electric lights, sanitary facilities. But then he contrasts that with what? The last sentence or the last word that I read right there. He contrasts scientific civilization with the Japanese way. The Japanese way. And now me, a New Yorker in 2020, I'm thinking, what the heck is Tanizaki talking about when he calls something the Japanese way? I think that's going to be the question that's going to have to sit in the back of our minds throughout this whole essay, while we read this whole essay, while we analyze this essay. What is this contrast between scientific civilization and the Japanese way? Well, perhaps by the end of this talk, we could have some sort of response to that question, right? On page 8, he says, "But I know as well as anyone that these are the empty dreams of a novelist, and that having come this far, we cannot turn back. I know that I am only grumbling to myself and demanding the impossible." I love that quote. Why? Because at the beginning, a few moments ago, I said, wait a second, doesn't Tanizaki seem a little bit like a grumpy old man screaming at kids, "Get off my lawn! Oh, kids these days, they got no respect." What I love about Tanizaki's essay here is he says, yeah, that's what I'm doing. I'm grumbling to myself and demanding the impossible. What does he mean by saying he's demanding the impossible right here? It seems to me that he's acknowledging that when he pits these two different ideals, modernization or westernization or scientific civilization, with the past or traditional Japan or the Japanese way, what is impossible? It seems like what he's acknowledging is it's impossible for this Japanese way to survive. That this modern, that this Western, that this scientific civilization is going to take over. And he sees that, it seems like, by calling it the impossible, he seems that that is inevitably going to happen. It's impossible for the old Japanese way to prevail. However, what is he discussing here? How does he engage? How does he wrestle with this inevitability of scientific civilization overcoming traditional Japanese way? Well, he says, if my complaints are taken for what they are, however, there can be no harm in considering how unlucky we have been, what losses we have suffered in comparison with the Westerner. He's saying we have lost something here. And there he explicitly calls out the Westerner as the contrast of the Japanese way. So here we've got scientific and Westerner on one side, and we've got Tanizaki, a grumbling old man, and the Japanese way on the other side. And here's what he says. Look at the losses we have suffered. Look at the losses we have suffered. He knows the inevitable is going to happen. Modernization, scientific progress, history progresses a certain way towards the inevitable. There are going to be these inevitable losses. These losses we have suffered. What sort of losses is he talking about here? Well, he's really talking about the arts. And he talks about several arts in different places, many different places throughout this essay. But obviously, one thing he talks about regarding the arts that are suffering are photography, music, conversation, paper, pottery, food, the temples, the houses, the rooms, scrolls and paintings, no theater, kabuki theater, bunraku theater. And what underlies all of these, actually? We'll talk about this no versus kabuki debate that he has. I find it fascinating. But what do all of these arts that are being suffered, these losses that Japan is suffering, artistically at least, they all have this common thread throughout them, and that is darkness. After all, the essay is called In Praise of Shadows. In Praise of Shadows. And part of his thesis is that this traditional Japanese way praises shadows. There's value of darkness in all of the things I just mentioned. In music, there's a darkness in Japanese music, and darkness is essential to the Japanese music. So he wants to put forward, at least. Pottery. There's a darkness to the patina that the Japanese pottery traditionally has. The temples, the architecture in general, values darkness. The paintings value darkness. No theater especially. Darkness is a key thing in no theater. And darkness is going to play a role in so much of traditional Japanese values, traditional Japanese arts. That's how it's essentially, at least according to Tanizaki, going to go against this Western scientific modernization, where everything is illuminated by lights and everything is illuminated by electricity. Just look at modern Japan today, even. Clearly, Tanizaki has lost this argument. Well, he knew he was going to lose anyway. Just look at photographs of downtown Tokyo. Very few places in the world love electricity as much as Japan does today. And many people lament this. Tanizaki first, or very early on, at least in 1933, is lamenting what he considers the inevitable and what ended up being the course of history, where everything is illuminated as opposed to darkness, which is ultimately opposed to traditional Japanese values, traditional Japanese artistic values. And so this essay, In Praise of Darkness, right? However, here's the question that comes up to me now. What does this say about contemporary 21st century Japanese art? Now, many of us, and many of you, might have been drawn into Japanese art, Japanese culture by way of Japanese animation and Japanese illustration and Japanese comics. What does that say? What is Tanizaki saying about those? Well, it sounds like Tanizaki would say something like, well, of course, that's the direction that Japan went. However, they're a uniquely modern Japanese development. You pick your favorite anime, right? It's probably, very often at least, very bright, especially the most popular anime cartoons and animated films are going to be very brightly colored and very illuminated, not very dark. Here's a question I've got to Tanizaki then. Does this mean that those Japanese works, contemporary animated films, contemporary illustrations, contemporary comic books, does that mean they're not Japanese? That's where it's going to be tough for me to wrestle with Tanizaki here. Isn't he ultimately saying, yeah, that's, or it sounds to me at least, that he's kind of saying, yeah, that's new Japanese. That's not real Japanese. That's a transformed Japanese, a modern Japanese. How many of us in our own lives wrestle with those questions on a daily basis, especially with our parents? Aren't parents always telling us, oh, your generation are leaving behind the old ways. I can't believe it. You're not really blank, fill in the blank. You're not really Greek. You're not really Mexican. You're not really Japanese. You're not really Chinese. Isn't Tanizaki acting like that older generation and looking down upon the younger generation? It seems to me that he's doing that. Right? It seems to me that it's very clear that he's doing that. However, what's another way to interpret this? Now I want to get into the themes. And of course, the plot and the thesis is very closely intertwined with the themes of this work. But what is he trying to do here? Is my complaint about this essay valid? Or am I missing something? Well, let's wrestle with this and see if George is missing something about what Tanizaki is really trying to say. Let's turn ahead to page 35 now. The novelist Takebayashi Musoan said when he returned from Paris a few years ago that Tokyo and Osaka were far more brightly lit than any European city, that even on the Champs-Élysées there were still houses lit by oil lamps, while in Japan hardly a one remained, unless in a remote mountain village. Perhaps no two countries in the world would waste more electricity than America and Japan, he said, for Japan is only too anxious to imitate America in every way it can. So there we see a big element of what Tanizaki is talking about. What I read when I read this paragraph on 35 is not so much that Tanizaki is looking to the future or the younger generation to say, what you all are doing is wrong. Oh, when your animated films, they're way too bright. By the way, we could do a whole other discussion on how anime is so indebted to the American way. But what is he saying right here? My goodness, isn't it a tragedy that we are merely anxious to imitate America in every way? What does that mean? That tells me that he's not so worried about electricity, that he's not so worried about bright lights, that he's not so worried about bright art. Rather, what he's really worried about is not having that balance and merely adopting all of this modernization, Westernism, and Americanism, he says explicitly, whole lock, stock, and barrel. shouldn't we also remember traditional Japan? Let's not throw out the baby with the bathwater, so to speak. Instead of just imitating America in every way, shouldn't we find the balance? Imitate America in certain ways. By the way, he goes throughout this text, like I read way back on page 1. He acknowledges that if you have a family, you need modern electricity and modern heating and modern toilets. I don't want to talk too much about it, but I love his long digression about the beauty of Japanese toilets. I'm not sure that I'm all with him there, right? And I'm not sure that many people would be with him where he's trying to sell traditional Japanese toilets. However, it seems here that he's merely lamenting that Japan and the Japanese are borrowing everything to the terrible loss of traditional ways. Isn't there a place, it seems like Tanizaki is asking, isn't there a place for traditional Japan, traditional ways, traditional art, traditional values, alongside with modern art, modern values, modern technology? And it seems to me that's what Tanizaki is really after here, is trying to find the balance between the traditional and the modern. And by the way, is this a problem that is unique to Japan in 1933? One of the intertextual connections that really speaks to me is a nonfiction work written in English by an author named Alex Kerr called Dogs and Demons, Tales from the Dark Side of Japan. And one of the things that Alex Kerr writes about in this book, he reflects a lot of the same sentiments that Tanizaki wrote about in 1933, especially regarding electricity and concrete, how the Japanese society in at least 2001 loved pouring concrete wherever they could. What does that mean? It means that they're pouring concrete over forests, over lands that were originally given to nature. Now there's concrete and cities. The other thing that he complains about a lot in that nonfiction book is the use of electricity. Anybody, of course, can just look at pictures, overhead pictures of the big cities in Japan and see how much electricity and neon lights. Tanizaki was writing about neon lights in 1933. My goodness. If he could raise from the dead today and look at Tokyo today, he would go, yep, I figured it'd be like this. I figured it'd be like this. The other thing, of course, the other obvious intertextual connections that Tanizaki makes is in regards to no theater, traditional no theater, but also traditional kabuki theater. What's odd to me about this debate is that he seems to elevate no to true traditional Japan and kabuki as somehow vulgar. This is a very old evaluation regarding the two. Of course, whenever there's a new art form, it's always considered vulgar by the elders of society. But by the time Tanizaki was writing, kabuki was already old and traditional by the time he was kicking around. So why does he sound like somebody from the 15th and 14th century complaining about kabuki being gaudy and filled with light? I don't know. I find that to be a fascinating debate, though, that he's taking two traditional Japanese forms of theater and pitting them against each other and picking a winner. He says no is the true, dark Japanese art form. That to me is fascinating. I can't quite make sense of it. Why does he discount kabuki? Because I think it's a little bit intellectually dishonest of him. After all, kabuki is traditional Japan, especially by 1933 it was traditional Japan. What is all of this really speaking to? This problem that I first had with the essay, which is, doesn't he realize that art and culture and values evolve? Progress always goes forward. Now, I don't mean progress in terms of positive, negative, good or bad, but rather history progresses. History moves forward. So what is wrong with new styles of art? What is wrong with brightly colored animated films from Japan? And especially many of us will look at these films and say, yes, that is Japanese. And what would Tanizaki say to that? Would he lament that Japanese animated films are so popular and bright? I don't know. Isn't that just how art progresses and evolves? And history and culture evolve just the same way. So to focus on one value and say, wait a second, this is traditional Japan, this is real Japan, darkness, shadows, seems a bit to miss the point of the evolution of art. But again, perhaps I have missed the point, and he isn't dismissing new art forms like photography. He dismisses photography, despite the fact that Japan has produced plenty of amazing photographers today, right? Since Tanizaki was kicking around. Japan produces, in my estimations, the best cameras in the world today. Is that not Japanese? I don't know how to make sense of that, unless he's really not denying that history progresses, but rather that, listen, all that Tanizaki and people like Tanizaki want to do is help find that balance between the traditional and the new. Isn't it a problem that every generation deals with? Who that's watching this right now doesn't have a parent or somebody from the older generation that's saying, kids these days. By the way, if you're old enough like I am, you've probably already said that yourself about kids these days. I know I say that all the time. Kids these days. Isn't this a challenge that every generation has to deal with? And Tanizaki is brilliant here for putting it into words, articulating it so beautifully, and applying that sentiment that seems to be, one that every generation has. Certainly every generation of Japanese literature has this sentiment in it. Tale of Genji lamented. This was in the Heian era 1,000 years ago. They lamented, in the past, my goodness, why can't things be like they were in the good old days? In the Manyoshu, the earliest Japanese poetry anthology, you can see lamentations about, if only things were the way they were in the past. And in 1933 Japan, we have the Lamentations of Tanizaki complaining about, aren't we borrowing too much from this new modernization and forgetting about the past? And that seems to be the terrible sort of thing that he's wrestling with. I complained earlier, is Tanizaki like the grumpy old man? He is to a certain degree. However, he approaches his grumpy old manness in a very interesting way. And one of the themes of this essay is resignation. It seems to me that Tanizaki is resigned to the inevitable. And we really see that on page 39. The morals of the young, they lamented, are not what they once were. It struck me that old people everywhere have much the same complaints. He's acknowledging that he's addressing this universal theme of getting old and seeing the times a-changing. He says a little bit further down, never has there been an age that people have been satisfied with. But in recent years, the pace of progress has been so precipitous that conditions in our own country go somewhere beyond the ordinary. The changes that have taken place since the restoration of 1867 must at least be as great as those of the preceding 3.5 centuries. So he's acknowledging that he's being a grumpy old man, just like every old person everywhere. However, he's saying, but it's different now, isn't it? It's different because aren't we undergoing so much change? Well, I wonder. I'm not going to deny that there was a huge revolution in society in Japan from the starting at the Meiji Revolution, the Meiji Restoration. But don't every generation say the same thing? Oh, yeah, but it's not like before. This is different. Don't we hear that even right now? I think so. And that seems to soften my sentimentality for Tanizaki's complaint right now, just a bit. I am convinced, on page 39, a little bit lower, I am convinced that the conveniences of modern culture cater exclusively to youth, and that the times grow increasingly inconsiderate of old people. Again, isn't that the complaint of old folks everywhere? That they don't care about me anymore. They don't care about my ways anymore. Times are changing. The youth is leaving me behind and ignoring me. Now I'm starting to feel a little sorry for Tanizaki. Of course, when you're an old man screaming at kids to get off your lawn, it's hard to be a little bit empathetic with such an old man who screams at you. But when you hear him cry almost about how inconsiderate society is to old people, now I can start to feel a little bit more emotions and regret for the way that I treat old people. And isn't that a complaint that is just as legitimate today as ever? How do you treat the old people in your community? How do I treat the old people in my community? How does society treat old people? Of course, society is more catered towards youth. But doesn't that mean that something's missing then? That something's being lost, that somebody is suffering? And that's the value that I see here in Tanizaki's essay, is not so much that the old is being overtaken by the new, because he acknowledges this is the course of history. This is what has happened every generation. But rather to remind us of what is being lost. What is being lost here? And this is where being a beautiful writer like Tanizaki helps us understand what is being lost, and helps us perhaps try to pull some of those things from being lost, keep some of those things from falling into oblivion. And that's why I like studying history. That's why I like studying art history. That's why I like reading these old books from 1933, and this not even that old, and even older books, so that we don't lose what might be lost. And I think that's the value of what Tanizaki's trying to remind us about. Yes, I know, Tanizaki says, I know I'm going to fall away into oblivion, just like every old person everywhere. But please don't forget me. And please heed my suffering. Because, by the way, it's going to happen to all of us, isn't it? On that note, I think we'll leave for next time. Hope you join me again for the next installment. Bye-bye.